Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. As summer winds down and the new school year kicks off, many parents and students are gearing up for a transition that involves more than just new backpacks and school supplies. And tonight, the doctor is in the house to provide some essential back-to-school tips that every parent should keep in mind, from ensuring your child is up to date on immunizations to fostering mental wellness. We are covering it all. We also have some age-appropriate readiness tips to help your child ease into the school year smoothly. So whether you are a first-time parent or a seasoned pro, tonight's Medical Monday conversation is for you. My guest is Dr. Keisha Davis, Montgomery County Health Officer. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for joining the conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Harold. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sure thing. So you're a parent. Your kids are also going back to school. What is the first thing that you believe parents should check off of their list before sending their children back to school?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I am a parent. I have 3 boys. We just sent my oldest off to college yesterday. I've got one going into high school and one who's wrapping up elementary school. So we have been in all of those different ages and stages. And so the first thing is putting on that public health hat, which may not be the first thing that parents are thinking about, but is vaccinations. It's in the news all over. We want to make sure that our kids have the best start. And so they're not worrying about, are they going to get sick from measles that they pick up in their school, or flu or COVID? And so we want to make sure that our kids have their vaccinations. In fact, in Maryland, kids, and DC and Northern Virginia, kids are required to have their vaccinations at the start of school. And so for our youngest ones who are entering kindergarten, they're expected to have their MMR. That protects them against measles, their hepatitis B, polio, and varicella. Those are required for getting into kindergarten. And then for our kids, once they're going into 7th grade, they're expected to have their updated tetanus shot and a meningitis shot. You want to make sure that you have those. Those are required. You like to have them by the start of school, but really also they need to be done by the 20th day of school, and the school systems are keeping track of that. When we think about, all that we heard that was going on in Texas earlier this year with the measles outbreak, we did not see that in our area because we have such high vaccination rates. We have seen, and we do see in the DMV, isolated cases of measles. Often someone's traveled abroad and they've come back, and the health department tracks, and we, look for contacts. And those cases don't spread because in this area, we have people who are vaccinated. And so we know that when a high percentage of the population is vaccinated against measles, you need around 95%. That protects the surrounding community. And we see that in this area. So first of all, we want to make sure kids are healthy to start. And so they've got those baseline vaccinations. Beyond that, we also want to be thinking about different ages and stages, how we're dealing with their physical health, with their emotional and mental health, the anxiety that comes with going back to school, and tailoring that for the different ages. So we're thinking about elementary school kids a little bit differently than we're thinking about our middle schoolers, a little bit differently from our high schoolers, and even those like my son who are going off to college.
You spoke quite a bit about several subjects, and I do want to back up just a little bit and take them kind of one at a time. One of the major things, as you may or may not have heard, that Maryland U.S. Senator Angela Alsobrooks was unable to attend the annual Maryland Association of Counties event over the course of the weekend. Why? Because she has once again contracted COVID. COVID is still with us.
COVID is still with us. It is still causing infections. It is still causing people to go to the hospital and have severe illness. While we are luckily that it doesn't cause as severe illness as what we were seeing in the past, in large part because of vaccination and because of the level of immunity that folks have, COVID is not gone. It is probably here with us in the same way that the flu is here with us. And it is important to get that that vaccination if and when it becomes available. We are paying attention to what is happening. Many folks are familiar with ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices at the
I'm not, so
Health
I
and
just
Health.
learned. I just learned something. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that the health secretary canceled the previous members of back in the early summer and then replaced it. And usually that body would have by now come out with recommendations for fall vaccines around flu and COVID. And they have not done that yet. So we are, people are saying, well, should I get my COVID vaccine? Should I get my COVID vaccine? And we are, kind of still waiting on the federal government for those final recommendations. But we do know that COVID is still out there. We, recommend that people be cautious. And the advice is, if you're feeling sick, whether it be COVID or flu or RSV, you should stay home. You shouldn't spread that to other people. If you need to be out, you should wear a mask so that you're not increasing the risk and spread to other folks.
Is it too early to start thinking about the flu, even though the annual flu vaccines are probably, a month or two away?
It is not too early. It's not too early to start thinking about respiratory viruses. They tend to come on quick. We are seeing kind of every year, we've seen a bit of a summer wave around COVID, and we're seeing that now. It's hard to know exactly when that flu bump is going to start to rise, but this is around the time of year, usually late August, early September, when we start to see those flu vaccines arriving on pharmacy shelves.
You mentioned some of the kind of foundational vaccines and shots that children need to get. Is there any new information, however, about vaccines and those foundational health shots that perhaps we did not have this year? Any updates that you can think of? There may not be, but
well, I will say there's not really any updates, at least as far as the science goes.
okay.
There have been some changes around recommendations. I think one to highlight is around the RSV vaccine for our seniors. So we know that RSV is most impacted in our infants, newborns, and seniors. And the recommendation is now that everybody over 75 should get that vaccine, and those 65 and older should get that vaccine and have a conversation with their doctor. Whereas in the past, the recommendations were a little bit different. But we now know that there's really good benefit, everybody 75 and over, getting that RSV vaccine. And there is expanded availability. I believe there's a new vaccine for newborns for RSV. We have seen a great drop in hospitalizations related to RSV because of these vaccines at the extremes of life. And I just want to highlight here when we talk about vaccines in babies and newborns, we're starting to see it now with the RSV vaccine, that now we are seeing fewer babies in the hospital having respiratory illness because of the RSV vaccine. We saw that decades ago with things like the Haemophilus we call it HIB, the HIB vaccine. With MMR, these things used to cause meningitis. They used to cause hearing loss. They used to cause really severe illness where, we as doctors were doing, lumbar punctures on infants. Any infant that was less than 90 days old that came in with a fever automatically got a lumbar puncture. And, those protocols have changed because of vaccines, and we don't see those illnesses anymore. And so I just want to highlight the importance that we see in vaccines and how that has really decreased childhood illness. I'll just give you a story. My grandmother, who recently passed, she was 106 years old, but when she was little, her brother almost died of whooping cough, and she had a brother who did die of meningitis. Both of those are now vaccine preventable diseases. And so when we think about, the impact of kids growing up in the 1920s and 30s, many of them didn't see adulthood. And, those are problems that we don't have to worry about today.
Thank you for sharing that. A very important story. I do want to ask also about something called hand, foot, and mouth disease. So daycares saw an uptick of that. What concerns do you have for children who may have been exposed, may have actually had the disease, and what should parents look out for? And I guess the first question is, what is hand, foot, and mouth disease?
Sure. So hand, foot, and mouth disease is a virus that causes cold-like symptoms, runny nose, sore throat, and it can cause a rash on the palms and soles. It can be, for the kiddos, they're pretty uncomfortable because of the sore throat and because of the rash. Kids bounce back from it pretty quickly, whereas the adults sometimes takes us a little bit longer to bounce back from it. We have seen an uptick in it this year. It's another viral infection. We don't have a vaccine that prevents it. So, sometimes there's worry that, well, we have vaccines for everything. We don't have vaccines for everything. There's lots of things, infections that kids get that we don't have a vaccine for, this being one of them. Usually it is a pretty benign illness. The kids feel down and sick with a fever for a few days, but they tend to bounce back. And it's usually supportive measures. The rash is what we call a viral exanthem, so that can signal the end of that. The best way to protect is good hand washing, covering your cough, not spreading disease, staying home when you're sick. Another infectious disease that we have seen a lot of this year that has been pretty persistent is norovirus, which causes gastrointestinal illness, sometimes vomiting or diarrhea. Again, the best way to prevent that is frequent hand washing. One thing that I will add with norovirus is that hand sanitizers are not that effective against it. And so good old soap and water actually does a better job than hand sanitizer against norovirus. It can be pretty persistent. Both of these tend to pop up in daycares. And so, those parents who may be sending their kid to daycare for the first time or back to daycare, I've got a nephew who's in daycare, making sure, teaching those good hand washing skills early. Sometimes it can be hard to get 2-year-olds to wash their hands, but getting them in the habit of doing that is really, really important. Your daycare center should be wiping down their surfaces at the end of the day. But we know kids are going to pick something up. They're going to put it in their mouth. They're probably going to get sick. Supportive care, most of these kiddos are going to be just fine. But, parents, pack your patience with kids in daycare. I know those, when they're first starting daycare, they are going to kind of run through a few different infections while they build up their immunity. What we want is that get those diseases and make sure that the ones that we can prevent with vaccines, they're not having to worry about getting sick with those.
2-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 42-year-olds with the hand washing thing. I think we have learned, some of us, I would say, have learned just those basic hygienic practices and how, in some cases, even life-saving they may be.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Sometimes it's just about getting back to basics. Washing your hands and getting lots of water, getting your vitamins from food, which, as we're talking about our kids and getting back to school, I think that's an important thing to think about as we're talking about how can we prepare our kids well for getting back to school. One of those things is lunch. So, what are you putting in your kids' lunch? Are they buying school lunch? How are we making sure that they're getting those nutrients? Pack the rainbow. Eating the rainbow is a good way to think about getting the vitamins that they need. So are they getting a good, protein, a fruit, beverage, whether that's, some milk or, maybe it's juice. You don't want them to be having a lot of juice, trying to get your kids used to having water for lunch, put a water bottle in, as opposed to that juice box. But really trying to get into the habit of getting those fruits and vegetables with every meal. And that includes taking them for lunch as well.
That's something I guess I never really thought about, because when you were going through that list, I knew that you were going to say juice, and instead you did say water. And we know, of course, that we need to keep the adults hydrated, but from day to day in school, I just never really considered the importance of having children staying hydrated. And now I'm certainly telling my age, because the water fountains in most schools have been off since the pandemic, as it were. So that is certainly something to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Kids need that hydration, especially when you think about them, running at recess and at lunch. And more schools are starting to get into the habit of allowing them to have a water bottle during the school day. I know when I was in school, we didn't have water. It was maybe a water fountain, but now
Right.
my kids, keep the water bottle by their desk. And, I think encouraging that habit that water is the first thing that we're going to is a good one to start early.
Mm. Dr. Davis, stay with us. We are going to, of course, take a break, and we want to remind our listeners, don't forget you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insights segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. This conversation continues on Sirius XM, channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We are continuing our Medical Monday conversation about making sure your child has a healthy re-entry into the new school year. And by the way, this is just part one of a multi-part series that we are doing this week regarding the return to school and education. My guest tonight is Dr. Keisha Davis, Montgomery County Health Officer. I do want to go back to some of the other issues that are impacting young people. What do you believe are the common back to school health mistakes that parents make?
So, I think there's a few things. One is not giving our kids enough time to make that transition back to school. Maybe we start the weekend before of, getting them up early. Start now. I think for most of the schools in the DMV region, we've got a week. School starts in a week in Montgomery County and Prince George's County. Start now with getting your kids up early, trying to get them back on that schedule so it's not as much of a fight next week when they need to get out the door. Open the door for those conversations about what they might be anxious about. What they might be worried about for the upcoming school year, whether it's the kid that they think hasn't been nice to them, or whether it's the teacher that they're worried about, or maybe they're worried about the classes that are coming. Maybe for our older kids, worried about what those social and friend circles are going to be. Starting to have those conversations with our kids about what they need to be successful for the year that's coming.
I do want to drill down a little more about those back to school jitters. I mean, certainly these things are normal. I remember being nervous and maybe in some cases excited, but we are certainly hearing more reports about anxiety related to going back to school, stress going back to school. If what I may have felt going back to school in elementary school, or in the Wayback Machine, junior high school, for example, my parents' response was, okay, go to school. Now we are having whole conversations that are considerably more expansive than get up and go to school. So what has changed?
Yeah, I think part of that is an awareness of, those jitters that we felt. And I think one of the things that parents can do is help to normalize those conversations with their kids. I think a lot of times kids feel like they're the only one who feels nervous or jittery about going back to school, because what they see on social media is everybody is handling it just fine. So helping to normalize that it's okay to feel anxious. You're probably not the only one. In fact, you are not the only one who's feeling anxious. Let's talk about what that looks like, and helping them to kind of manage the behind the scenes of the perfection that they might see on social media versus the reality of what's going on. And helping your kids to recognize the difference between normal back to school jitters and when they might need help. So it's normal to feel anxious. It's normal for your heart to race. It's normal to not want to get up in the morning and go to school, especially those first couple of weeks as your body is getting adjusted to those new times. When we start to be worried is Are they just not able to get out of bed? Is the fear overwhelming? Are they calling in the middle of the day? Often they'll feel bad in the morning, but once they get to school, things work out. Are they not able to make it through the school day without calling back home? Those are signs where it might be worth getting help from the school counselor or maybe outside of school to help a little bit with those, with the jitters and with that transition. I think the most important thing is, though, to open the door for that conversation.
Interesting. And when you talk about things that may be age appropriate, for example, are things different beyond the obvious, let me say? Are things different for elementary school age children as opposed to teenagers? What is it that parents should be paying attention to for their teenagers compared to with
Sure.
the little ones?
Absolutely. When we think about our young ones and getting them ready for back to school, a lot of what they're focused on, in the elementary school age, they're focused on, lunch, supplies, teacher, friends, and making sure they have what they need to be successful in that. As we start to get into, middle and high school, what becomes more important to our kids tends to be more and more on the kind of social and friend group. And so helping to support them along the way for that. Especially also, as kids are growing older, thinking about maybe they have chronic diseases, asthma, attention deficit disorder, obesity, maybe they're taking medications, and thinking about at each of those ages and stages, how you support them in taking more control of their health. In elementary school, it's telling them when to go to the nurse. Maybe in middle school, it's telling them you keep the inhaler with you and here's how you know when to use it. At high school, creating more of those independence. But it's also around, how you're having those conversations. I know when my middle schoolers were starting, I had a conversation with each of them with my boys around how do you be a good person. Middle school social environment can be hard. Kids can be hard. And so talking to them about the things that you say to other people, how you receive the things that are said to you. I had probably saw it on Instagram or TikTok or social media about squeezing out a tube of toothpaste. Tell your kids to squeeze out a whole tube of toothpaste, make a mess of it, squeeze it all out, get every last drop, and then say, put it back in. You can't put it back in. The words that you say, you can't put them back in. So be really intentional about the words that are coming out of your mouth. And I think those are really good messages for middle schoolers, thinking before they speak, thinking about what they say, thinking about the impact that their words have on the kids that are around them. For our high schoolers and some of our middle schoolers too, also thinking about more of those complex topics around drugs and alcohol and sex. And so thinking about, do we need to be having conversations with our kids about not just what's going in their lunch, but thinking about condoms and Narcan and vaping and all of those things that are happening in college. And I know none of your kids are doing that and none of my kids are doing that, but maybe their friends are. So having a conversation about where the condoms are, how to use Narcan, and what to do if somebody asks you about vaping are all conversations that are really important to be having with our kids.
When you had the conversation with your boys about being a good person, I am particularly interested in what they said about it, because this is foundationally a problem that the broader community is having, because obviously some of the adults that are walking around did not have a Dr. Keisha Davis as a mother. Okay. And so they did not have that critical conversation. So what did they say when it's one thing for them to say, okay, mom, but I'm really curious about their reaction and their thoughts if they shared with you what they said about being a good person, and what was that conversation like?
You know, Harold, my kids are like most kids. And so when I said, let's have a conversation about being a good person, they rolled their eyes at me just like your kids rolled their eyes at you. So, I don't have magic here. But I think it's, showing again and being open to have the conversations. What I find with my children, and I think a lot of parents, is that when I sit down and say, let's talk about this, they roll their eyes and leave. What is important is being there in the times when my kids most want to talk is when I am in the middle of doing something for work, when I'm getting ready to go to bed, when my husband is washing dishes. And so a lot of times it's being there and being willing to have the conversation on their timeline and not necessarily on mine.
Your husband washes dishes? That's another show.
My husband washes dishes. Yes, okay. He does.
Yeah, we'll bring you back for that show next week. So what did your son say about, well, after the eye roll, when you had their attention? How did they speak about this issue?
They didn't say much at the time, but I will say what I have gotten from my boys, I think over the years now, with one just graduating high school and one, just finishing up middle school, going into high school, is, they come to me then with the difficult situations when the kid is saying something that doesn't seem right to them. You say, well, why did he say that? Or why did she say that? That doesn't seem right. Like, I don't know, but let's talk about how you can do it different. How do you say, how do you respond when someone is, not valuing you? And I think it's reinforcing to them, we value you. You are bigger than that. Let's talk about how to respond, whether it's coming up with a joke, whether it's walking away, whether it's calling an adult. It's usually not getting into a fight, and helping them to think about what are the different ways that you can respond to that situation. And there are many different ways, and they are, depending on the kid. Some respond better with humor, like some of my kids are better with humor, and others are better at, I'm just not going to engage with you. And so helping your kid to figure out what's the best way for me to engage or not engage in the situation.
I did want to talk also a little bit more about mental health. I mean, and this is just one of the really big conversations that is happening in the town square, so to speak, where, and I will say that in speaking with parents who are in, my social circle, those who are of a certain age, whose children are now young adults. They are out of high school, some of them, out of college, and almost to a person, we would say that when we were in, junior high school, when we were in high school, that these things didn't happen. Now, they may have happened. We were not aware of these mental health struggles. And so, anecdotally speaking, these things did not happen. Even when we were in college, back in the pre-internet days, that these things were not an issue. And so from a professional and medical perspective, what do you believe has happened over the past 30 years where now, other than the fact that people are more comfortable talking about it, there are obviously medical reports and news reports about these issues. But from a grassroots perspective, these things are definitely happening. What were they always there? Did we not recognize it? Or has the world changed so drastically?
I think a lot of these were there. We didn't recognize it. We didn't have the tools to speak towards it. We didn't have the parents or grandparents who would allow that conversation. And so what we saw were higher rates of alcoholism, higher rates of, substance use, suicide, much of this stuff that went unnoticed and not talked about. And, I think that there has been a real openness, awakening around mental health and mental health concerns and behavioral health, and the ability to just have a conversation about it. I think we can all think back to high school, to the friend who maybe was on the brink of something, who maybe was struggling with something that we couldn't see. And maybe we couldn't see it at the time. Maybe it's now looking back of, I can think of some friends who at the time I didn't know what to do with. They were a little weird. And now I look back and say, they had depression or anxiety, or maybe there was some abuse going on that I didn't know how to recognize back then. And I think it's a really wonderful thing that our kids now know how to recognize that in ways that we didn't. And they know how to, in some ways, call out for help for a friend. That's some of the things that we're teaching. I know we have some peer ambassador programs through the health department in schools that teaches kids to better recognize that in their friends. And I think, are there some kids that we could have saved back when I was in school, either from suicide or drug use, that because we just didn't have the language, we just didn't know how to recognize it then, that things could have turned out differently for them. And so I think, is there some over attention? Maybe, right? Are we picking up things that maybe the minor anxiety or the minor depression that before would have been, just swept under the rug and ignored? Potentially, but I think in the long run, the ability to recognize that, call that out, the way that this generation isn't going to accept the just bury it deep inside until it explodes, I think is a good thing at the end of the day. And so how we continue to foster that, and also at the same time, teach kids and young adults those skills of resilience. And so, one of the things that I, talk about with my kids, they don't like public speaking. And I say, I don't like public speaking either. I feel the same butterflies in my stomach when I get up to speak that you do. And I've learned how to kind of work through it and deal with it. And so it's helping to teach folks to say, maybe a little bit of anxiety is okay. It helps to drive you forward. How do we make sure that your anxiety is not the block from getting you to the things that you need to do, that you want to do? And that helping to foster some of that careful tension.
I think you made a point that a lot of people really should understand, again, including my adult peer group. That was such a great example where, yes, if you look back to the times when we were in not elementary school, but what would now be considered middle school, or just take high school. And you said, yes, I remember there was a guy or a gal who, they were maybe a little weird, and you kind of steered clear of them, didn't really give it much thought. But now when you look back, and in some cases you may even encounter them as full-grown adults and realize that what little bit you saw then has evolved into a full-blown issue or concern. And I don't think, obviously, that children really think about this, and I know we didn't really consider that, but I think that's a really, really good example.
Yeah. I think that's something that we see. Harold, another thing I want to make sure that we touch on is around drug use in school, especially this conversation around our, high schoolers and college students and young adults. So, a few years ago, this area really saw a spike in overdoses, many of them related to fentanyl. And we did a big push around education around fentanyl. We were seeing it, lots of pills that were spiked with fentanyl. So people were, getting Xanax or, Adderall, and, finding that it was laced with fentanyl and having overdoses. And so we know that, don't trust anything unless it's prescribed for you. And then, what we started to see is people actually going after fentanyl and purchasing fentanyl. And we know that Narcan, naloxone, is life-saving. We know that, all schools in Montgomery County, and I think in the district in Northern Virginia, also have it in their health rooms available. Principals have been trained, nurses have been trained on how to use it. But also, this is an important conversation to have with your youth. And, I don't think anybody wants to think that their kid is using drugs, and hopefully your kid isn't, but maybe they will be there when somebody is using and can help to save a life. And I think understanding how to use Narcan is as important as knowing how to do CPR.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole lot easier than doing CPR. It is comes in a device. It's easy to use. You spray it in the nose and can help revive somebody who may have overdosed from opioids, particularly fentanyl. And I think having that conversation about how kids can, one, see the signs of somebody that may be using in a friend or in a peer, and also being able to provide that rescue treatment if it should if it should be needed. There is a delicate balance, because often what comes up is that just permission for kids to use drugs? It's not right. Yeah. You say, oh, well, then they're just going to experiment and have their friend bring them back. What I'm trying to do with Narcan, with naloxone, is save lives. I think the most important thing is saving lives, and I don't want some, kids dying unnecessarily because of it. Does that mean you don't have conversations about why you should stay away from drugs? No, of course, we still have conversations about why we shouldn't be using drugs and what the harms are to that. But at the same time, having that conversation about both prevention and harm reduction, are conversations that need to be happening one-on-one or hand in hand.
I want to talk to you also about bullying a little bit more. Often when we have these conversations, it centers around how do you know that your child is being bullied? But I don't believe that I've ever had a conversation with any public health person about how do you know if your child is bullying? And let us assume that there may not be some of the cause and effects, such as broken home, problems at home, whatever that looks like. And it can look like so many things. And so assuming that all is well at home, how do you know that your child is bullying? And what might be the cause of such a thing if everything is well at home?
That's a great question. And, I don't know that I have all the answers. I'll have to ask my behavioral health colleagues. But one of the things that we see is bullies often are bullied. And so it tends to be cyclical. So, if your kid is being bullied, it might also be worth asking them, are they bullying somebody else? Because often, if your kid is getting picked on, they may be turning that on somebody else. So, don't just say, my kid is being bullied, that's awful. Are they making that an outlet for somebody else? Other, things are there. If your kid is having difficulty in social circles, so do you find that your kid, I'm talking kind of more elementary, middle school, not getting invited to birthday parties, not getting invited to social settings? Explore that a little bit. Is that because they are being bullied, or is that because kids don't want to invite the bully to their party? And so, sometimes it's trying to take the bird's eye view on some of those social situations. So maybe start inviting the kids to hang out at your house rather than having your kid hang out at other people's house, just so you can kind of watch and monitor how those social interactions are happening. How does your kid seem to be interacting with other kids when they think that you're not looking? Is a good way to try and start to gauge that. If they are, if they play on a sports team, how are they interacting with their teammates on the field, or when they're on the sidelines, when they think that you're not there looking at them. Because, my kids, and I'm sure your kids, know how to turn it on and off when mom and dad are there. So, trying to get a sense of how they are when you're not in the room, talking to their teachers and their coaches is another good way to kind of get that sense. And, that was something that we always asked at parent-teacher conferences. So, I want to make sure that my kids are doing well in school, but I also want to make sure that they're good humans. And so asking specifically, these are the grades. That's great. I expect good grades, but I also expect them to be treating their classmates well. And so sometimes you have to ask. The teachers are like, sometimes they think all the parents care about are the grades. I want to know how my kid is interacting socially with their peers, how they are, responding to the environment in the classroom. And so sometimes it takes asking, but teachers I've found are very much want to share that information.
Real quick, I only have just a very short time moving towards the end of this conversation, but how do you address issues with children regarding emotional resilience? And I know this is a taboo topic because everybody's getting participation trophies, everybody's protecting their peace, but the world is still coming. So what does that conversation look like with children?
I think a lot of it is around how do you help prepare children for difficulty with guardrails. It's like, you go bowling and you've got the kids have the protectors, right? So they don't get the gutter ball. How do you start to do that and then start to take those gutter balls away? And as parents, we can craft some of that. So with our, elementary school kids, maybe it's letting them feel the pain of forgetting their lunch and not driving it up to school and having them buy school lunch, because they're still going to give them lunch, right? Even if you don't drive their lunch to school. So letting them feel a little bit of that discomfort of forgetting that. Maybe for your middle schooler, it's letting them feel the discomfort of forgetting their homework and not driving it up to school. Or, maybe that means they have to spend their lunchtime doing the homework. For your high schooler, maybe it's letting them feel the impact of that bad grade rather than reaching out to the teacher to get them to change it right away, have them do some of that outreach and advocacy for themselves. How can we start to create, give our kids that environment of feeling a little bit of that discomfort and also teaching them to prepare for the world, because the challenges just get bigger and mom and dad can't always step in to fix it. And we probably can start a little bit earlier with letting them feel some of that discomfort when we know that there are still a little bit of guardrails, and starting to take some of those guardrails away as they get older.
I think that's a good place to end this conversation. Dr. Keisha Davis with the Montgomery County Health Department. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. This was great.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on.
That is the Daily Drum for this Monday, August 18th. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.